George Washington, February 22, 1732 to December 14, 1799, was a pivotal American founding father, military leader, and statesman who served as the first President of the United States from 1789 to 1797. Appointed by the Second Continental Congress as the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775, Washington guided the American forces to victory in the Revolutionary War. His leadership was instrumental in securing the British surrender and leading to the Treaty of Paris, which recognized the independence of the United States. Additionally, Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where the U.S. Constitution was drafted. This distinguished him as a central figure in American history, earning him the title of the Father of his Country. Washington's initial public role was as a surveyor for Culpeper County in the colony of Virginia, a position he held from 1749 to 1750. By 1752, he had received military training and was promoted to major in the Virginia Regiment. During the French and Indian War, he rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel in 1754 and subsequently led the Virginia Regiment from 1755. Later, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses and became a delegate to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. There, he was appointed as the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. After leading American forces to a decisive victory and the end of the Revolutionary War, Washington resigned his commission in 1783, marking the end of his military service. George Washington played a crucial role in the adoption and ratification of the U.S. Constitution, which replaced the Articles of Confederation in 1789. Elected unanimously by the Electoral College, he served 2 terms as president, beginning in 1788 and again in 1792. As the first president, Washington established a strong and financially sound national government while skillfully navigating the political rift between his cabinet members, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. He maintained a policy of neutrality during the French Revolution and supported the Jay Treaty to strengthen relations with Britain. Washington set many enduring precedents for the presidency, including the principles of republicanism, a peaceful transition of power, the use of the title, Mr. President, and the tradition of serving only 2 terms. His 1796 farewell address remains a significant statement on republicanism, emphasizing national unity and warning against the dangers of regionalism, partisanship, and foreign influence. Washington's legacy is deeply embedded in American culture. He is commemorated through numerous monuments, a federal holiday, and various media portrayals, as well as geographical names like the national capital and the state of Washington. In 1976, he was posthumously promoted to the rank of General of the Armies, the highest rank in the U.S. Army. Consistently ranked among the greatest U.S. presidents, Washington's contributions continue to be celebrated and studied for their impact on the nation's history. Let's talk about Washington's early life. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, at Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was the first of 6 children born to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. Augustine, his father, was a notable public figure and a justice of the peace, and he had 4 additional children from his previous marriage to Jane Butler. In 1734, the family moved to Little Hunting Creek before eventually settling at Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, Virginia. After Augustine's death in 1743, George inherited Ferry Farm along with 10 slaves, while his older half-brother Lawrence inherited Little Hunting Creek, which he later renamed Mount Vernon. Washington did not receive the formal education his older brothers did at Appleby Grammar School in England, but he attended the Lower Church School in Hartfield. There, he studied mathematics, including trigonometry and land surveying, and developed skills as a draftsman and mapmaker. By early adulthood, He was known for his writing, which was described as having considerable force and precision. As a teenager, Washington practiced his penmanship by compiling over 100 rules for social conduct, known as rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation, which he copied from an English translation of a French book of manners. Washington frequently visited Mount Vernon and the Belvoir estate, owned by William Fairfax, Lawrence Washington's father-in-law. Fairfax became a mentor and surrogate father to Washington. In 1748, Washington spent a month surveying Fairfax's property in the Shenandoah Valley. The following year, he received a surveyor's license from the College of William and Mary. Despite not having completed the customary apprenticeship, Thomas Fairfax appointed him as the surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia, where he took his oath of office on July 20, 1749. Washington became well acquainted with the frontier region, and though he resigned from the position in 1750, he continued to conduct surveys west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. By 1752, he had purchased nearly 1,500 acres in the valley and owned a total of 2,315 acres. In 1751, Washington traveled to Barbados with Lawrence, hoping that the climate would improve his brother's tuberculosis. During the trip, Washington contracted smallpox, which left him with slight facial scarring. After Lawrence's death in 1752, Washington leased Mount Vernon from his brother's widow, and he inherited the estate outright upon her death in 1761. Moving on to Washington's colonial military career. Lawrence Washington's role as Adjutant General of the Virginia Militia inspired George Washington to pursue a military commission. Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, appointed George as a major and commander of one of the 4 militia districts. During this time, the British and French were vying for control of the Ohio Valley. The British were building forts along the Ohio River, while the French established their presence between the Ohio River and Lake Erie. In October 1753, Dinwiddie sent Washington as a special envoy with a mission to demand that French forces vacate lands claimed by the British. Washington was also tasked with negotiating with the Iroquois Confederacy and gathering intelligence on French forces. Meeting with Half-King Tanacharison and other Iroquois leaders at Log Sound, Washington collected valuable information about French fortifications and prisoners held by the French. Tanacharison bestowed upon Washington the name Kanotakoreus, meaning devourer of villages, a title that had previously been given to Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington, by the Susquehannock in the late 17th century. By November 1753, Washington's party reached the Ohio River, but was intercepted by a French patrol and escorted to Fort Le Boeuf. There, Washington delivered the British demand to the French commander, St. Pierre, who declined to leave. After a few days' delay, St. Pierre provided Washington with an official response, as well as food and winter clothing for the return journey. Washington completed this challenging mission in 77 days under harsh winter conditions. His report, which was published in both Virginia and London, earned him considerable recognition. George Washington in the French and Indian War. In February 1754, Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie promoted George Washington to lieutenant colonel and made him second in command of the Virginia Regiment, which numbered around 300 men. Washington was tasked with confronting French forces at the forks of the Ohio. He set out with half the regiment in April, and soon discovered that a French force of 1,000 had begun constructing Fort Duquesne in the area. By May, after establishing a defensive position at Great Meadows, Washington learned that the French camp was only 7 miles away and decided to take the offensive. Washington advanced on May 28 with a small force of Virginians and allied Native Americans to ambush the French. The French detachment, which turned out to be only about 50 men, was caught off guard, and many were killed, including French commander Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, who was carrying a diplomatic message for the British. The French later found their dead and scalped countrymen, blaming Washington for the incident. Washington retreated to Fort Necessity following the ambush. The Virginia Regiment joined Washington at Fort Necessity the following month, bringing news that he had been promoted to colonel and given command of the regiment after the death of the previous commander. The regiment was reinforced by a separate company of 100 South Carolinians led by Captain James Mackay, whose royal commission outranked Washington's, leading to a conflict of command. On July 3rd, a French force of 900 men attacked, and the resulting battle ended in Washington's surrender. In the surrender document, Washington inadvertently accepted responsibility for assassinating Jumonville, a misinterpretation he later attributed to a mistranslation by the document's translator. Afterward, Colonel James Innes assumed command of the intercolonial forces, leading to the division of the Virginia Regiment. Washington was offered a captaincy in one of the newly created regiments, but he declined, viewing it as a demotion. Instead, he chose to resign his commission. The Jumonville affair became the catalyst for the French and Indian War, which later expanded into the broader conflict known as the 7 Years' War. In 1755, Washington voluntarily served as an aide to General Edward Braddock, who led a British expedition to drive the French from Fort Duquesne and the Ohio country. On Washington's suggestion, Braddock divided the army into a main column and a lightly equipped flying column. Unfortunately, Washington was stricken with severe dysentery and was initially left behind. When he rejoined Braddock near the Monongahela River, the French and their Indian allies ambushed the divided forces. The ambush resulted in heavy casualties, with 2/3 of the British force affected, including the mortally wounded Braddock. Despite his illness, Washington, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, helped rally the survivors, form a rear guard, and facilitated the retreat of the remaining troops. During the battle, Washington had 2 horses shot from under him, and his hat and coat were pierced by bullets. His bravery under fire helped restore his reputation, which had been questioned after the Battle of Fort Necessity. However, he was not involved in the subsequent planning of operations under Colonel Thomas Dunbar, the new commander. In August 1755, the Virginia Regiment was reformed, and Dinwiddie appointed Washington as its commander with the rank of colonel. Washington soon clashed over seniority with Captain John Dagworthy, who commanded a detachment of Marylanders at Fort Cumberland and held a superior royal rank. Eager for an offensive against Fort Duquesne, Washington believed Braddock would have granted him a royal commission and pursued this with Braddock's successor, William Shirley, in February 1756, and again with Shirley's successor, Lord Loudon, in January 1757. Shirley supported Washington only in the dispute with Dagworthy, while Loudon refused to grant him a royal commission and instead relieved him of the duty to man Fort Cumberland. In 1758, Washington's regiment was assigned to the British Forbes expedition to capture Fort Duquesne. Disagreeing with General John Forbes' tactics and route, Washington was nonetheless made a brevet brigadier general and given command of one of 3 brigades designated for the assault on the fort. By the time of the assault, the French had already abandoned the fort and the valley, leading to a friendly fire incident that resulted in 14 dead and 26 wounded. Frustrated, Washington resigned his commission shortly afterward and returned to Mount Vernon. Under Washington's leadership, the Virginia Regiment defended 300 miles of frontier against 20 Indian attacks over 10 months. He enhanced the regiment's professionalism as it expanded from 300 to 1,000 men, with Virginia's frontier suffering fewer attacks compared to other colonies. Although he did not achieve a royal commission, Washington gained valuable self-confidence, leadership skills, and insight into British military tactics. His experience with the destructive competition among colonial politicians further shaped his support for a strong central government. Let's talk about his marriage, as well as his civilian life. On January 6, 1759, at the age of 26, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a 27-year-old widow of a wealthy plantation owner, Daniel Parke Custis. The wedding took place at Martha's estate. Martha, known for her intelligence, grace, and experience in managing a plantation, and Washington enjoyed a happy marriage. They settled at Mount Vernon, near Alexandria, where Washington became a planter of tobacco and wheat and began to establish himself as a political figure. Washington's encounter with smallpox in 1751 is believed to have left him sterile, though it is also possible that Martha suffered complications during the birth of her last child, Patsy, which could have affected her ability to have more children. The couple mourned their inability to have children of their own, but raised Martha's 2 children from her previous marriage, John Parke Custis, Jackie, and Martha Parke Custis, Patsy. They also cared for Jackie's 2 youngest children, Eleanor Parke Custis, Nellie, and George Washington Parke Custis, Washie, along with various nieces and nephews. Through the marriage, Washington gained control over Martha's 1/3 dower interest in the 18,000-acre Custis estate, managing the remaining 2/3 for her children. The estate included 84 slaves, making him one of the wealthiest men in Virginia and enhancing his social standing. At Washington's urging, Governor Lord Boudetort honored Dinwiddie's 1754 promise to provide land bounties to all volunteer militia members from the French and Indian War. In late 1770, Washington inspected lands in the Ohio and Great Kanawha regions and hired surveyor William Crawford to divide them. Crawford allocated 23,200 acres to Washington, who then informed the veterans that the land was hilly and unsuitable for farming. Washington agreed to purchase 20,147 acres himself, leaving some veterans feeling deceived. He also expanded Mount Vernon to 6,500 acres and increased its slave population by over 100 by 1775. As a respected military hero and significant landowner, Washington held local offices and was elected to the Virginia Provincial Legislature, representing Frederick County in the House of Burgesses for 7 years beginning in 1758. Although he first ran for the seat in 1755 and lost to Hugh West, he successfully won the 1758 election by offering voters beer, brandy, and other refreshments despite being away on the Forbes expedition. He garnered about 40% of the vote and defeated 3 opponents with local support. Initially, Washington rarely spoke or attended legislative sessions, but became a vocal critic of Britain's taxation and mercantilist policies in the 1760s, becoming more politically active. Washington imported luxury goods from England, paying for them with tobacco exports. However, his extravagant spending combined with declining tobacco prices left him £1,800 in debt by 1764, leading him to diversify his investments. In 1765, he shifted Mount Vernon's primary cash crop from tobacco to wheat due to soil erosion and other issues, and expanded into corn flour milling and fishing. From 1768 to 1775, Washington was counted among Virginia's political and social elite, hosting around 2,000 guests at Mount Vernon and being known for his exceptional hospitality. He also enjoyed leisure activities such as fox hunting, fishing, dancing, theater, cards, backgammon, and billiards. Washington's stepdaughter Patsy suffered from epileptic seizures from the age of 12 and passed away at Mount Vernon in 1773. The day after her death, Washington wrote to Burwell Bassett, "It is easier to conceive than to describe the distress of this family." He suspended all business activities and stayed with Martha every night for 3 months to support her. opposition to the British Parliament, and the American Revolution. Before and during the American Revolution, Washington was a pivotal figure. His distrust of the British military began when he was overlooked for promotion into the regular army. He was also opposed to the British Parliament's taxes on the colonies, without proper representation. Additionally, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited American settlement west of the Allegheny Mountains and safeguarded the British fur trade, further fueled his discontent. Washington viewed the Stamp Act of 1765 as an act of oppression and celebrated its repeal in 1766. However, in March 1766, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted that parliamentary law took precedence over colonial law. The late 1760s saw increasing tensions due to British interference in American land speculation, which contributed to the outbreak of the American Revolution. As a prosperous land speculator, Washington encouraged land acquisitions in the western backcountry in 1767. He also played a leading role in the protests against the Townshend Acts of 1767 and proposed a boycott of British goods in May 1769. The Townshend Acts were largely repealed in 1770. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. Washington viewed these measures as an invasion of our rights and privileges, and argued that Americans should resist acts of tyranny, cautioning that submission would make them as subservient as the enslaved people they oppressed. That July, Washington and George Mason drafted resolutions for the Fairfax County Committee, including a call to end the Atlantic slave trade, which were adopted. On August 1, 1774, Washington attended the First Virginia Convention and was selected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress. As tensions mounted in 1774, he helped train militias in Virginia and organized the enforcement of the Continental Association's boycott of British goods. The American Revolutionary War began on April 19, 1775, with the battles of Lexington and Concord and the siege of Boston. Upon hearing the news, Washington was deeply concerned and quickly left Mount Vernon on May 4, 1775, to join the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Moving towards the military career of George Washington and his role as Commander-in-Chief. On June 14, 1775, the Continental Congress established the Continental Army, and John Adams nominated George Washington as its Commander-in-Chief, citing his military experience and the strategic advantage of having a Virginian lead to better unite the colonies. Washington was unanimously elected by Congress the following day. Appearing before Congress in uniform, Washington delivered his acceptance speech on June 16, declining a salary but later agreeing to be reimbursed for his expenses. He was officially commissioned on June 19 as General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies and of all the forces raised or to be raised by them, and was instructed to take command of the siege of Boston on June 22, 1775. Congress appointed his primary staff officers, including Major General Artemas Ward, Adjutant General Horatio Gates, Major General Charles Lee, Major General Philip Schuyler, and Major General Nathaniel Greene. Henry Knox, a young bookkeeper with a strong knowledge of ordnance, impressed both Adams and Washington and was promoted to Colonel and Chief of Artillery. Washington was similarly impressed by Alexander Hamilton's intelligence and bravery and later promoted him to colonel and appointed him as his aide-de-camp. Initially, Washington prohibited the enlistment of both free and enslaved black individuals into the Continental Army. The British capitalized on this by offering freedom to enslaved people who joined their forces. By late 1777, facing a shortage of manpower, Washington reversed his stance and allowed black enlistment. By the end of the war, approximately one-tenth of Washington's army was comprised of black soldiers. After the British surrender, Washington sought to enforce the terms of the Preliminary Treaty of Paris, 1783, by retrieving slaves who had been freed by the British and returning them to servitude. He made this request to Sir Guy Carleton on May 6, 1783. However, Carleton instead issued 3,000 freedom certificates, allowing all former slaves in New York City to leave before the British evacuated the city in late November 1783. The Siege of Boston. In early 1775, in reaction to the escalating rebellious activities in the American colonies, London dispatched British troops to Boston under the command of General Thomas Gage, who was the leader of British forces in America. The British established fortifications that rendered the city virtually impregnable. In response, local militias encircled Boston, effectively trapping the British troops and creating a standoff. As Washington advanced towards Boston, news of his approach spread ahead of him, and he was met with widespread enthusiasm. By the time he arrived on July 2, 1775, 2 weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill, he had become a prominent symbol of the Patriot cause. Setting up his headquarters in Cambridge, Washington discovered that the army was largely composed of undisciplined militia. He promptly implemented the reforms suggested by Benjamin Franklin, which included rigorous training and the imposition of strict discipline. Washington directed his officers to assess the skills of the recruits to ensure military efficiency and remove those who were deemed incompetent. He also petitioned his former superior, General Gage, to release Patriot officers who had been captured and to treat them humanely. In October 1775, King George III declared the colonies to be an open rebellion, removed Gage from command due to incompetence, and appointed General William Howe as his replacement. By January 1776, the Continental Army had dwindled to 9,600 men due to the expiration of short-term enlistments and needed reinforcement from militia. The arrival of heavy artillery from Fort Ticonderoga, brought by Henry Knox, provided a significant boost. Washington was eager to seize the opportunity to cross the frozen Charles River and attack Boston directly, but General Gates and others cautioned against striking well-fortified positions with untrained militia. Instead, Washington decided to secure Dorchester Heights, situated 100 feet above Boston, and place Knox's artillery there to compel the British to leave. On March 9th, Washington's forces launched a nighttime bombardment of British ships in Boston Harbor. By March 17th, the British, along with Loyalists, began a disorganized 10-day evacuation aboard 120 ships. Shortly thereafter, Washington entered the city with 500 men, explicitly instructing them not to loot. He chose not to interfere in civilian matters, leaving local governance to the city's authorities. The Battle of Long Island. After the victory in Boston, Washington anticipated that the British would regroup and target New York City, a stronghold of Loyalist support. He arrived in New York on April 13, 1776, and promptly ordered the construction of fortifications to prepare for the anticipated British assault. To avoid the abuses experienced by Bostonians under British occupation, he also instructed his troops to treat civilians and their property with respect. British General William Howe, with reinforcements from Halifax and supported by the British fleet, set his sights on New York. George Germain, overseeing the British war effort from England, believed a single decisive strike could secure victory. Beginning July 2nd, the British forces, including over 100 ships and thousands of troops, began arriving on Staten Island to lay siege to the city. Following the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, Washington informed his troops on July 9th that Congress had declared the colonies to be free and independent states. At this point, Howe commanded a force of 32,000 regulars and Hessian auxiliaries, while Washington's army numbered 23,000, mainly composed of inexperienced recruits and militia. In August, Howe landed 20,000 troops at Gravesend, Brooklyn, and began advancing towards Washington's fortifications. Despite inaccurate intelligence suggesting Howe had only around 8,000 troops, Washington chose to engage in battle. In the Battle of Long Island, Howe attacked Washington's flank, resulting in 1,500 Patriot casualties compared to 400 British losses. Washington was forced to retreat, instructing General William Heath to procure river craft. On August 30th, General William Alexander managed to hold off the British long enough for Washington's forces to cross the East River to Manhattan under cover of darkness, though Alexander was captured in the process. Emboldened by his victory, Howe sent a message to Washington, addressing him as George Washington, Esq., in an attempt to negotiate peace. Washington declined, insisting on being recognized with proper diplomatic protocol as a general, not a rebel, to protect his men from execution if captured. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy bombarded the unstable earthworks on Lower Manhattan. Despite his reservations, Washington followed the advice of Generals Greene and Putnam to defend Fort Washington. The fort was ultimately lost, and Washington ordered his army to retreat north to White Plains. Howe's forces pursued Washington, compelling him to fall back across the Hudson River to Fort Lee to avoid encirclement. By November, Howe had captured Fort Washington, inflicting significant American casualties. Washington, though blamed for the delay in the retreat, shifted responsibility to Congress and General Greene. Loyalists in New York City viewed Howe as a liberator, and spread false rumors that Washington had set fire to the city. With morale at a low point following the capture of General Lee, Washington's army, now reduced to 5,400 troops, retreated through New Jersey, while Howe established winter quarters in New York. George Washington's crossing of the Delaware River, Battle of Trenton, Battle of the Assunpink Creek, and Battle of Princeton. After crossing the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, Washington was joined by General John Sullivan and an additional 2,000 troops. The Continental Army's future was uncertain due to dwindling supplies, a harsh winter, expiring enlistments, and desertions. Washington was also disheartened by the strong Loyalist sentiment and skepticism about independence in New Jersey. British General Howe, having divided his forces, stationed a Hessian garrison at Trenton to control western New Jersey and the Delaware River's east shore. Desperate for a decisive victory, Washington and his generals planned a surprise attack on Trenton. The strategy involved crossing the Delaware in 3 separate divisions, one led by Washington, 2,400 troops, another by General James Ewing, 700 troops, and the third by Colonel John Cadwalader, 1,500 troops. Washington's division was to take the Pennington Road, while Sullivan's was to move south along the river's edge. Washington ordered a 60-mile search for Durham boats to transport his army, and the destruction of any vessels that could be used by the British. Risking capture, he personally scouted the Jersey shoreline before the crossing. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington's troops crossed the ice-choked river from McConkey's Ferry, with 40 men per vessel. Despite harsh conditions and the river's turbulent waters, the army completed the crossing by 3 a.m. on December 26 without any losses. Knox, delayed by difficulties with horses and field guns, arrived later. Cadwalader and Ewing were unable to cross due to ice and strong currents, so Washington proceeded to Trenton rather than risk returning to Pennsylvania. Upon nearing Trenton, Washington discovered Hessian positions about a mile from the town and split his force into 2 columns. He rallied his men with the command, "Soldiers, keep by your officers. For God's sake, keep by your officers." The columns diverged at the Birmingham crossroads, with General Greene's column taking the Upper Ferry Road and General Sullivan's advancing on River Road. The Americans marched through sleet and snow, many suffering from bloody, shoeless feet. 2 soldiers died from exposure. At dawn, Washington, supported by Knox and artillery, launched a surprise attack on the unprepared Hessians and their commander, Colonel Johann Rall. The Hessians suffered 22 dead, including Colonel Rall, 83 wounded, and 850 captured along with their supplies. After this victory, Washington retreated across the Delaware to Pennsylvania. On January 3, 1777, he launched an attack on British regulars at Princeton, resulting in 40 American casualties and 273 British soldiers killed or captured. During the battle, Generals Hugh Mercer and John Cadwalader were pushed back by the British, and Mercer was mortally wounded. Washington led a counterattack, coming within 30 yards of the British line. The British troops eventually retreated, with some taking refuge in Nassau Hall, which was targeted by Colonel Alexander Hamilton's cannons. Washington's troops charged, leading to a swift British surrender with 194 soldiers capitulating. Following this, Howe withdrew to New York City, where his army remained inactive until the following year. Washington established winter headquarters at Jacob Arnold's Tavern in Morristown, New Jersey, where he received munitions from the Hibernia mines and disrupted British supply lines. In Morristown, Washington ordered the inoculation of Continental troops against smallpox, despite the Continental Congress's prohibition of such measures. This decision proved effective, with only isolated cases of infection and no regiments incapacitated by the disease. While the British retained control of New York, many Patriot soldiers chose not to re-enlist or deserted after the grueling winter campaign. In response, Congress offered greater incentives for re-enlistment and increased punishments for desertion. Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton were pivotal, lifting Patriot morale and countering British strategies of overwhelming force and generous terms. By February 1777, news of these victories had reached London, signaling that the Patriots were now in a strong position to demand unconditional independence. Battle of Brandywine, Battle of Germantown, and Battles of Saratoga. In July 1777, British General John Burgoyne launched the Saratoga campaign, advancing south from Quebec through Lake Champlain and recapturing Fort Ticonderoga. His aim was to sever New England from the rest of the colonies and gain control of the Hudson River. However, General Howe, based in British-occupied New York City, made a strategic error by moving his army south to Philadelphia instead of joining Burgoyne near Albany. In response, Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette hurried to Philadelphia to confront Howe. On September 11, 1777, during the Battle of Brandywine, Howe outflanked Washington and entered Philadelphia unopposed. A subsequent Patriot attempt to dislodge the British at Germantown in October also failed. Meanwhile, in upstate New York, General Horatio Gates led the Patriot forces. Concerned about Burgoyne's advancing troops, Washington dispatched reinforcements north, including Generals Benedict Arnold, known for his aggressive tactics, and Benjamin Lincoln. On October 7, 1777, Burgoyne, cut off from Howe's support, attempted to advance on Bemis Heights but was forced to retreat to Saratoga. After the decisive battles of Saratoga, Burgoyne surrendered. This victory, while significant, led to increased criticism of Washington, as Gates' success in New York drew attention away from Washington's challenges. Biographer John Alden observes that the comparison between Washington's setbacks and the triumphs in New York was inevitable. Public admiration for Washington began to wane, with even John Adams offering little praise. Valley Forge and Battle of Monmouth. In December 1777, Washington and his Continental Army, totaling 11,000 men, encamped for the winter at Valley Forge, located north of Philadelphia. The harsh conditions led to the loss of between 2,000 and 3,000 soldiers due to disease, malnutrition, and inadequate shelter. While the British forces were comfortably quartered in Philadelphia and paid for supplies in pounds sterling, Washington struggled with the depreciated value of American paper currency and dwindling resources. The local game had been exhausted, and by February, morale among his troops had plummeted, leading to increased desertions. An internal dissent among Washington's officers, led by Major General Thomas Conway, led some members of Congress to consider removing him from command. Washington's supporters successfully thwarted these efforts, and the issue was eventually resolved after considerable debate. Conway, once the conspiracy was uncovered, issued an apology to Washington, resigned his commission, and returned to France. Washington persistently appealed to Congress for essential provisions. After a congressional delegation inspected the Army's conditions, Washington underscored the urgency of the situation, declaring, "Something must be done. Important alterations must be made." Congress responded by reorganizing and strengthening the Army's supply lines, leading to improved provisions by late February. During this time, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben's rigorous training transformed Washington's troops into a well-disciplined fighting force by the end of the winter. For his contributions, Washington promoted von Steuben to Major General and appointed him Chief of Staff. In early 1778, following the defeat of Burgoyne, France entered into a treaty of alliance with the Americans. Congress ratified the treaty in May, marking a French declaration of war against Britain. In May 1778, British General Howe resigned and was succeeded by Sir Henry Clinton. The British evacuated Philadelphia for New York in June, and Washington convened a war council with American and French generals. He opted for a partial engagement against the retreating British at the Battle of Monmouth. Generals Charles Lee and Lafayette, leading 4,000 men, initiated an attack on June 28 without Washington's prior knowledge, resulting in a failed first assault. Washington replaced Lee and managed to secure a tactical draw. As night fell, the British continued their retreat to New York, and Washington moved his army outside the city. The Battle of Monmouth marked Washington's final engagement in the North. Culper Ring and military career of Benedict Arnold, 1777 to 1779. Washington became America's first spymaster by establishing an espionage network to counter British operations. In 1778, at Washington's direction, Major Benjamin Talmadge organized the Culper Ring, a covert operation designed to gather intelligence on British movements in New York. Despite Benedict Arnold's previous commendable service, including his campaigns in Quebec and Saratoga, Washington overlooked Arnold's instances of disloyalty. However, in 1780, Arnold began providing British spymaster John Andre with critical information intended to undermine Washington and seize West Point, a crucial American fortification on the Hudson River. Historians Nathaniel Philbrick and Ron Chernow suggest that Arnold's defection may have stemmed from resentment over missed promotions, dissatisfaction with Congress, significant debt, and disappointment with Washington's support during his court-martial. In August 1780, after much negotiation, Washington assigned Arnold to command West Point. On September 21, Arnold met with Andre and handed over plans to capture the garrison. Andre was captured by American militia while returning to British lines, and the incriminating documents were discovered. Upon learning of Andre's capture on September 24, Arnold immediately fled to HMS Vulture, the ship that had brought Andre to West Point, and escaped to New York. Reacting swiftly to Arnold's betrayal, Washington recalled the commander stationed at strategic points around West Point to prevent any potential collusion. He took personal command of the fort and reinforced its defenses. Andre was tried for espionage and sentenced to death. Washington offered to exchange Andre for Arnold, but British General Clinton refused the offer. Andre was executed by hanging on October 2, 1780, despite his request for a firing squad to set an example for other spies. Southern Theater of the American Revolutionary War. In late 1778, General Clinton dispatched 3,000 troops from New York to Georgia, launching a southern invasion against Savannah with an additional 2,000 British and Loyalist reinforcements. The British forces successfully repelled an attack by American patriots and French naval units, bolstering British efforts in the South. Earlier, in June 1778, Iroquois warriors, allied with Loyalist Rangers led by Walter Butler, devastated the Wyoming Valley in northeastern Pennsylvania, killing over 200 frontiersmen. In response to this and other attacks on New England towns, Washington ordered General John Sullivan in mid-1779 to lead a campaign aimed at driving the Iroquois out of New York. Sullivan's expedition sought to achieve total destruction and devastation of Iroquois villages and capture their women and children. The campaign systematically destroyed Iroquois settlements and food supplies, forcing over 5,000 Iroquois to flee to British Canada. While only a few hundred Iroquois were killed directly, historian Rhiannon Kohler notes that the campaign effectively halved their population, contributing to severe suffering during the harsh winter of 1779 to 1780. Some historians now describe the campaign as genocidal. Washington's army endured their harshest winter yet at Morristown, New Jersey, with temperatures plummeting below freezing, New York Harbor frozen, and snow covering the ground for weeks, exacerbating their lack of provisions. In January 1780, Clinton assembled 12,500 troops and attacked Charleston, South Carolina, defeating General Benjamin Lincoln. By June, the British had secured control of the South Carolina Piedmont. Clinton then returned to New York, leading 8,000 troops under General Charles Cornwallis. Congress replaced Lincoln with Horatio Gates, who, after his defeat at the Battle of Camden, was succeeded by Nathanael Greene, whom Washington had initially favored. Despite British dominance in the South, Washington was reinvigorated by the arrival of the Marquis de Lafayette from France with additional ships, men, and supplies. In July 1780, 5,000 veteran French troops, led by Marshal Rochambeau, arrived at Newport, Rhode Island, and French naval forces, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, also landed. Washington's army entered winter quarters at New Windsor, New York, in December 1780. He urged Congress and state officials to expedite supplies to alleviate the army's ongoing hardships. On March 1, 1781, Congress ratified the Articles of Confederation, which took effect on March 2, but lacked the power to levy taxes and only loosely unified the states. In a strategic move, General Clinton sent Benedict Arnold, now a British brigadier general, with 1,700 troops to Virginia to capture Portsmouth and conduct raids on Patriot forces. Washington responded by sending Lafayette south to counter Arnold's efforts. Initially planning to shift the conflict to New York, Washington changed course based on Rochambeau's advice, targeting Cornwallis in Virginia instead. With de Grasse's fleet blocking British retreat, Washington feigned an attack on New York before heading south to Virginia. The Siege of Yorktown. The Siege of Yorktown marked a decisive victory achieved by the combined forces of the Continental Army, led by Washington, the French army under General Comte de Rochambeau, and the French Navy commanded by Admiral de Grasse. On August 19, Washington and Rochambeau initiated what would become known as the celebrated March toward Yorktown. Washington commanded a formidable force of 7,800 French troops, 3,100 militia, and 8,000 Continentals. Although inexperienced in siege warfare, Washington frequently relied on Rochambeau's expertise and advice. Despite this, Rochambeau never challenged Washington's authority as the overall commander. By late September, the combined Patriot French forces had effectively surrounded Yorktown, trapping the British army and cutting off any chance of reinforcements from General Clinton in the north. Meanwhile, the French Navy secured a crucial victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake. The final American assault was signaled by a shot fired by Washington himself. The siege concluded with the British surrender on October 19, 1781, resulting in the capture of over 7,000 British soldiers. Washington spent 2 days negotiating the terms of surrender, with the official signing ceremony taking place on October 19. General Cornwallis, claiming illness, was absent from the ceremony and sent General Charles O'Hara as his representative. As a gesture of goodwill, Washington hosted a dinner for the American, French, and British generals, fostering an atmosphere of camaraderie among the military leaders, who regarded each other as members of the same professional fraternity. Following Yorktown, Washington relocated his army to New Windsor, New York, where they remained until the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, officially ending the war. Although the peace treaty was finalized 2 years after the battle, Yorktown effectively represented the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. The British Parliament agreed to cease hostilities in March 1782, signaling the de facto end of the conflict. George Washington's resignation as commander-in-chief. When peace negotiations commenced in April 1782, both British and French forces began to gradually withdraw. With the American treasury depleted, unpaid and disgruntled soldiers led to the suspension of Congress. In March 1783, Washington intervened to quell the Newburgh Conspiracy, a planned mutiny by American officers, by securing a promise from Congress for a 5-year bonus for the soldiers. Washington also submitted an expense account of $450,000, a sum equivalent to $9.53 million today, which he had personally advanced to the Army. Although the account was settled, it was reportedly vague about large expenditures and included costs related to visits from his wife to his headquarters. In April 1783, a congressional committee headed by Alexander Hamilton began transitioning the Army to peacetime operations. Washington contributed his views through his sentiments on a peace establishment, advising Congress on maintaining a standing army, establishing a national militia composed of state units, and creating a navy and a national military academy. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, officially recognized American independence. Washington disbanded his army and delivered a farewell address to his soldiers on November 2. He oversaw the British evacuation from New York, which was marked by parades and celebrations. Washington, accompanied by Governor George Clinton, took formal possession of the city on November 25. In early December 1783, Washington bid farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern and resigned as commander-in-chief. In his final address to Congress, he stated, "I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God and those who have the superintendence of them to His holy keeping." His resignation was met with acclaim both domestically and internationally, demonstrating to a skeptical world that the new republic would not descend into disorder. In the same month, Washington was appointed President General of the Society of the Cincinnati, a hereditary organization of Revolutionary War officers, and he held this position for the rest of his life. Confederation period, and the Articles of Federal. Washington returns to Mount Vernon. Washington was eager to return home after spending only 10 days at Mount Vernon during over 8 years of war. He arrived on Christmas Eve, delighted to escape the demands of military life and public duties. Celebrated as a hero, he was warmly received during a visit to his mother in Fredericksburg in February 1784, and welcomed by a steady stream of well-wishers at Mount Vernon. Upon returning, Washington resumed his interest in the Great Dismal Swamp and Potomac Canal projects that he had initiated before the war. Despite his efforts, these ventures yielded no financial gains. He also embarked on a 34-day, 680-mile journey to inspect his land holdings in the Ohio country. At Mount Vernon, he oversaw the completion of extensive remodeling, transforming his home into the mansion that stands today. However, his financial situation was challenging. He faced significant debts and taxes, and the estate had not generated any profit during his absence. Poor crop yields, exacerbated by pestilence and adverse weather, had led to 11 consecutive years of deficits by 1787, with little hope for improvement. To revive the estate's profitability, Washington implemented a new landscaping plan and successfully cultivated fast-growing trees and native shrubs. Additionally, he began breeding mules, having been gifted a Spanish jack by King Charles III of Spain in 1784. Few mules were present in the United States at the time, and Washington believed they could transform agriculture and transportation. The Constitutional Convention of 1787. Before retiring to private life in June 1783, Washington advocated for a stronger union. Despite his concern about potentially overstepping into civil matters, he issued a circular letter to the states, criticizing the Articles of Confederation as merely a rope of sand. He warned that the nation teetered on the edge of anarchy and confusion, was vulnerable to foreign interference, and stressed that a national constitution was needed to unify the states under a robust central government. The eruption of Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, fueled by dissatisfaction over taxation, reinforced Washington's belief in the necessity of a national constitution. In response, a group of nationalists convened in Annapolis on September 11, 1786, to urge Congress to revise the Articles of Confederation. They made a significant effort to persuade Washington to attend. Congress subsequently agreed to convene a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in the spring of 1787, with each state invited to send delegates. On December 4, 1786, Washington was initially selected to lead the Virginia delegation but declined on December 21 due to concerns about the legality of the convention. After consulting with James Madison, Henry Knox, and others, he was convinced to attend. They argued that his presence could encourage reluctant states to participate and lend legitimacy to the convention. On March 28, Washington informed Governor Edmund Randolph of his decision to attend, though he made it clear he was persuaded to do so. Washington arrived in Philadelphia on May 9, 1787, but a quorum was not reached until May 25. Benjamin Franklin nominated Washington to preside over the convention, and he was unanimously elected as President General. The convention was initially tasked with revising the Articles of Confederation, with the goal of establishing a new government once the resulting document was duly confirmed by the several states. On May 27, Randolph introduced James Madison's Virginia Plan, which proposed a completely new constitution and a strong national government. Washington endorsed the plan as a necessary step forward. Despite expressing doubts in a July 10 letter to Alexander Hamilton, where he confessed to almost despairing of a favorable outcome, Washington supported the delegates' efforts. He worked to garner support for ratification, even attempting to persuade skeptics like Anti-Federalists Edmund Randolph and George Mason. The final version of the Constitution was signed by 39 of the 55 delegates on September 17, 1787. Chancellor of William and Mary. In 1788, the Board of Visitors at the College of William and Mary reinstated the position of Chancellor and elected George Washington to the role on January 18. Samuel Griffin, the college rector, extended the invitation to Washington, who formally accepted the position in a letter dated April 30, 1788. Washington served as the 14th Chancellor of the College of William and Mary throughout his presidency, and continued in the role until his death on December 14, 1799. His first presidential election. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention had anticipated George Washington would become president and left it to him to define the role once elected. On February 4, 1789, state electors cast their votes for president, but Washington was uncertain if most Republicans had supported him. The Constitution mandated the counting of votes by March 4, but Congress did not achieve a quorum until April 5. The votes were counted the following day, revealing that Washington had received the majority of electoral votes from every state. Congressional Secretary Charles Thomson informed him of his election. John Adams, who received the second highest number of votes, was elected vice president. Despite his reluctance and anxious and painful sensations about leaving Mount Vernon, Washington set out for New York City on April 16 to assume the presidency. Presidency of George Washington. Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States on April 30, 1789, at Federal Hall in New York City. His procession featured a militia escort and a marching band, followed by statesmen and foreign dignitaries, drawing a crowd of around 10,000. Chancellor Robert R. Livingston administered the oath of office using a Bible provided by the Masons, and the occasion was marked by a 13-gun salute from the militia. Washington delivered his inaugural address in the Senate chamber, invoking divine blessings for the liberty and happiness of the American people. Despite his preference to serve without a salary, Congress insisted on compensating him, later providing $25,000 per year, equivalent to about $6.39 million today, to cover the costs of the presidency. In a letter to James Madison, Washington expressed his desire for his actions to set precedents based on true principles, preferring the title, Mr. President, over the more grandiose suggestions such as His Excellency or His Highness the President. His presidency established key precedents, including the inaugural address, presidential messages to Congress, and the formation of the cabinet. Although Washington initially planned to retire after his first term, political tensions persuaded him to continue in office. An effective administrator, he valued advice from his department heads and navigated a smooth transition of power. He remained nonpartisan, though he leaned toward Federalist ideals, and was cautious of the Republican opposition, preferring a strong central government over political factionalism. Washington faced several significant challenges. The Articles of Confederation proved inadequate, with weak leadership, no executive branch, a minimal bureaucracy, substantial debt, depreciated currency, and no authority to levy taxes. He needed to build an executive department from scratch and relied on Tobias Lear for guidance on selecting its officers. Additionally, Britain continued to occupy forts in the American West, and Barbary pirates harassed American merchant vessels in the Mediterranean, all while the United States lacked a naval force to address these threats. Cabinet of the United States. In 1789, Congress established several executive departments, the State Department in July, the War Department in August, and the Treasury Department in September. Washington appointed key figures to lead these departments: Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Edmund Randolph as Attorney General, and Samuel Osgood as Postmaster General. This cabinet, while pivotal, was not required by the Constitution, but became an important advisory body for Washington. Within Washington's cabinet, significant factionalism emerged, particularly between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, whose differing viewpoints starkly contrasted. Washington managed these divisions by confining cabinet discussions to topics he selected and refrained from engaging deeply in debates. He sometimes asked for written opinions from his cabinet members and expected them to implement his decisions effectively. Domestic issues. Washington, a staunch opponent of political parties, feared that their emergence could destabilize Republican principles. 246. He exercised his veto power with great caution, often signing bills he personally disagreed with, stating, "I give my signature to many bills with which my judgment is at variance." Despite his neutrality, his closest advisors were divided into two emerging factions, signaling the rise of the first-party system. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, established the Federalist Party, advocating for a strong national credit system and a powerful financial infrastructure. In contrast, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson opposed Hamilton's vision and led the Jeffersonian Republicans. Although Washington aligned more closely with Hamilton's policies, they sparked intense debate and controversy. To foster national unity, Washington declared November 26, 1789, as a day of Thanksgiving. He encouraged Americans to recognize the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. On this day, Washington observed the occasion by fasting and visiting debtors in prison, offering them food and beer. African Americans. In response to two anti-slavery petitions presented to Congress in 1790, slaveholders in Georgia and South Carolina threatened civil unrest if their interests were compromised. Washington and Congress reacted with several racially discriminatory measures. Naturalization was denied to black immigrants. Blacks were barred from serving in state militias. Slavery was permitted in the Southwest Territory, which would become Tennessee, and two new slave states were admitted, Kentucky in 1792 and Tennessee in 1796. On February 12, 1793, Washington signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law, which allowed slaveholders to reclaim escaped slaves across state lines, overriding state laws and courts. This law was met with strong opposition from free blacks in the North, who feared it would lead to increased bounty hunting and kidnapping. The act reinforced the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution and passed Congress with overwhelming support. At the same time, Washington signed a reenactment of the Northwest Ordinance of 1789, which had previously outlawed slavery in federal territory north of the Ohio River, though it did not apply to slaves escaping from slave states. The original 1787 law had expired with the ratification of the new U.S. Constitution. Washington also signed the Slave Trade Act of 1794, which significantly curtailed American involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. 255. On February 18, 1791, Congress admitted Vermont as the 14th state, effective March 4, 1791. The National Bank. During Washington's first term, economic issues were a central focus of his administration. A major challenge for the federal government was establishing public credit. To address this, Alexander Hamilton presented a plan to Congress, which was initially met with deadlock. In a pivotal moment, Hamilton, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson reached the Compromise of 1790. Jefferson agreed to support Hamilton's debt proposals in exchange for relocating the nation's capital first to Philadelphia, and eventually to a site near Georgetown on the Potomac River. The resulting legislation, the Funding Act of 1790 and the Residence Act, was signed into law by Washington. These acts authorized the federal government to assume and pay the nation's debts, funded by customs duties and excise taxes. Hamilton further stirred debate within the cabinet by advocating for the creation of the first bank of the United States. While Madison and Jefferson opposed the idea, the legislation to establish the bank passed Congress with relative ease. Jefferson and Edmund Randolph argued that such a bank exceeded the federal government's constitutional authority. Hamilton contended that the bank was permissible under the Constitution's implied powers. Washington aligned with Hamilton and signed the bank legislation into law on February 25, 1791. This decision deepened the rift between Hamilton and Jefferson, leading to open hostility. The first major financial crisis of the new nation occurred in March 1792. Federalists, allied with Hamilton, used substantial loans to gain control of U.S. debt securities, which led to a panic and a run on the national bank. The financial markets stabilized by mid-April, although Jefferson suspected Hamilton was involved in the scheme, despite Hamilton's efforts to address the crisis. The Jefferson-Hamilton feud. Jefferson and Hamilton held fundamentally opposing political philosophies. Hamilton advocated for a robust national government that necessitated a national bank and foreign loans for effective operation. In contrast, Jefferson believed that power should primarily reside with the states and favored an agrarian-based government. He was also opposed to the concept of banks and foreign loans. This ideological clash led to persistent disputes and friction between the two men, much to Washington's dismay. Hamilton insisted that Jefferson resign if he could not support Washington, while Jefferson warned that Hamilton's fiscal policies could lead to the downfall of the Republic. Despite Washington's pleas for a ceasefire for the nation's sake, their conflicts continued unabated. Jefferson's political maneuvers, including his backing of Freneau's National Gazette and his efforts to undermine Hamilton, nearly prompted Washington to dismiss him from the cabinet. Jefferson eventually resigned in December 1793, and Washington decided to part ways with him. This discord gave rise to the clearly defined Federalist and Republican parties, making party affiliation essential for congressional elections by 1794. Washington, while remaining detached from the congressional attacks on Hamilton, did not publicly defend him. Even amidst the scandal involving Hamilton and Reynolds, which threatened Hamilton's reputation, Washington continued to regard Hamilton with very high esteem. The Whiskey Rebellion. In March 1791, prompted by Hamilton and supported by Madison, Congress enacted an excise tax on distilled spirits to help reduce the national debt, with the tax taking effect in July. This measure provoked strong opposition from grain farmers in Pennsylvania's frontier regions, who felt overburdened and unrepresented. They likened their plight to the oppressive British taxation that led to the Revolution. On August 2, Washington convened his cabinet to address the unrest. While Washington was hesitant to use force, Hamilton advocated for a strong federal response to suppress the rebellion. Washington initially sought to avoid federal intervention by asking Pennsylvania state officials to address the situation, but they declined to act. Consequently, on August 7, Washington issued his first proclamation calling up state militias. In his address, he appealed for calm and reminded the protesters that, unlike British rule, federal laws were enacted by representatives elected by the people. Despite these efforts, opposition grew, leading to the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Washington issued a final proclamation on September 25, threatening military action if necessary. With the federal army unable to manage the situation, Washington invoked the Militia Act of 1792 to call up state militias. Troops, initially led by Washington himself and later by Henry Lee, were dispatched to the rebellious areas. They captured 150 individuals, with the remaining rebels fleeing. Although 2 of the prisoners were sentenced to death, Washington exercised his constitutional authority for the first time and granted them a pardon. Washington's decisive actions underscored the new government's ability to enforce laws and maintain order. This marked the first instance of federal military force used against its own citizens. Washington defended his measures as necessary to combat self-created societies he viewed as subverting national unity, acknowledging their right to protest but insisting that such dissent must not breach federal law. Congress supported his actions and extended their congratulations, though Madison and Jefferson remained largely indifferent. Foreign affairs. In April 1792, As the French Revolutionary Wars erupted between Britain and France, Washington declared American neutrality. The French Revolutionary government sent diplomat Edmond Charles Genet to the U.S., where he was warmly received. Genet established a network of democratic-republican societies to promote French interests, but Washington denounced these efforts and demanded that the French government recall Genet. On August 26, 1792, the French National Assembly honored Washington with French citizenship during the early stages of the French Revolution. Hamilton crafted the Jay Treaty to normalize trade relations with Britain, secure the withdrawal of British forces from Western forts, and address unresolved financial issues from the Revolution. Chief Justice John Jay, acting as Washington's negotiator, signed the treaty on November 19, 1794. While critical Jeffersonians supported France, Washington decided to back the treaty despite its pro-British terms, as it helped avoid war with Britain. He worked to sway public opinion and achieve Senate ratification, though he faced considerable criticism from the public. Under the treaty, Britain agreed to relinquish its forts around the Great Lakes, and the U.S. adjusted its boundary with Canada. The treaty also facilitated the settlement of many pre-revolution debts and opened the British West Indies to American trade, ensuring a decade of peace and prosperous trade with Britain. However, Jefferson argued that the treaty angered France and increased the likelihood of conflict. Relations with France soured, and just 2 days before Washington's term ended, the French Directory asserted the right to seize American ships, leading President John Adams to address the looming threat of war. Native American affairs. In the fall of 1789, Washington faced the challenge of Britain refusing to relinquish its forts on the northwest frontier and actively working to incite Native American tribes to attack American settlers. The Northwest tribes, led by Miami Chief Little Turtle, formed an alliance with the British to resist American expansion, resulting in the deaths of 1,500 settlers between 1783 and 1790. Washington declared that the government of the United States is determined that their administration of Indian affairs shall be directed entirely by the great principles of justice and humanity, advocating for treaties to address land interests. His administration viewed powerful tribes as foreign entities, and Washington even participated in traditional ceremonies, including smoking a peace pipe and drinking wine with them at the President's house in Philadelphia. He made numerous efforts to build relations, equating the killing of indigenous peoples with the killing of whites, and sought to integrate them into European American culture. In the Southwest, negotiations between federal commissioners and raiding Indian tribes seeking retribution were unsuccessful. Washington invited Creek Chief Alexander McGillivray and 24 leading chiefs to New York to negotiate a treaty, treating them as foreign dignitaries. On August 7, 1790, Knox and McGillivray concluded the Treaty of New York, which provided the tribes with agricultural supplies and granted McGillivray the rank of brigadier general along with an annual salary of $1,200, equivalent to $29,573 today. In 1790, Washington dispatched Brigadier General Josiah Harmar to pacify the Northwest tribes, but Little Turtle defeated him twice, forcing Harmar to retreat. 295, the Northwestern Confederacy of Tribes, using guerrilla tactics, proved a formidable force against the sparsely manned American army. Washington then sent Major General Arthur St. Clair from Fort Washington on an expedition to restore peace in 1791. On November 4, St. Clair's forces were ambushed and decisively defeated by tribal forces, with few survivors, 296. Washington replaced the disgraced St. Clair with Revolutionary War hero Anthony Wayne. From 1792 to 1793, Wayne trained his troops in Native American warfare tactics and instilled the discipline that had been lacking under St. Clair. 297. In August 1794, Washington authorized Wayne to drive the tribes out by burning their villages and crops in the Maumee Valley. On August 24, Wayne's forces defeated the Northwestern Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The subsequent Treaty of Greenville in August 1795 opened two-thirds of the Ohio country to American settlement. 299. Washington's second term. Washington initially planned to retire after his first term, feeling worn out by the demands of office and grappling with poor health. The infighting within his cabinet and criticism from partisan opponents further diminished his enthusiasm for a second term. Martha Washington also supported his decision not to run again. Additionally, Washington's nephew, George Augustine Washington, who managed Mount Vernon in his absence, was critically ill, intensifying Washington's desire to retire. Despite his reluctance, many influential figures urged him to seek a second term. James Madison warned that Washington's absence could exacerbate the dangerous political divisions within his cabinet and Congress. Thomas Jefferson also implored him to continue, promising to cease his attacks on Hamilton and agreeing to retire himself if Washington did. Hamilton argued that Washington's departure would be a severe blow to the country. With the 1792 election approaching, Washington eventually yielded and agreed to run for a second term. On February 13, 1793, the Electoral College unanimously re-elected Washington as president, with John Adams continuing as vice president by a vote of 77 to 50. Washington was sworn in on March 4, 1793, by Associate Justice William Cushing at Congress Hall in Philadelphia, then briefly addressed the public before retiring to the President's house. When the French Revolutionary Wars began on April 22, 1793, Washington issued a proclamation of American neutrality. He sought to maintain a conduct friendly and impartial toward the belligerent powers, and warned Americans against intervening in the conflict. 305. While Washington acknowledged France's revolutionary government, he eventually called for the recall of French Minister Edmond Charles Genet due to the Citizen Genet affair. Genet had provocatively engaged in actions against Spanish forces, British allies, and attempted to recruit American militias, but his efforts did not draw the United States into the war. On July 31, 1793, Thomas Jefferson resigned from the cabinet. Alexander Hamilton, seeking higher income for his family, resigned in January 1795 and was succeeded by Oliver Wolcott Jr. Washington's relationship with Hamilton remained amicable, but his rapport with Secretary of War Henry Knox deteriorated after rumors surfaced that Knox had benefited from contracts related to the construction of U.S. frigates under the Naval Act of 1794. Knox eventually resigned amid these controversies. In the closing months of his presidency, Washington faced increasing criticism from political opponents and a partisan press, which accused him of ambition and greed. He came to view the press as a divisive force spreading falsehoods. By the end of his second term, Washington retired for both personal and political reasons. He was disheartened by the personal attacks and wanted to ensure a truly contested presidential election. While he did not feel legally bound to a two-term limit, his voluntary retirement established a significant precedent. Washington's farewell address. In 1796, Washington chose not to seek a third term in office. Anticipating his retirement, he had instructed James Madison in May 1792 to draft a valedictory address, initially titled the Farewell Address. By May 1796, Washington had sent the draft to Alexander Hamilton for extensive revisions, with Washington making the final edits himself. The completed address was published by David Claypool's American Daily Advertiser on September 19, 1796. In his address, Washington emphasized the importance of national unity, asserting that a united America was essential for preserving freedom and prosperity. He cautioned against three major threats: regionalism, partisan conflict, and foreign entanglements. Washington urged Americans to transcend party divisions for the common good, focus on their own interests, and avoid foreign alliances that could influence domestic affairs. He advocated for friendship and commerce with all nations, but advised against involvement in European conflicts. Additionally, he underscored the significance of religion and morality as foundational supports for a republic. The address reflected Hamilton's Federalist views and economic policies. Washington concluded with a reflection on his legacy. Although I review my administration without a sense of intentional error, I am acutely aware of my imperfections and the likelihood of having made many mistakes. I earnestly pray that the Almighty will either prevent or lessen the impact of these mistakes. I hope that my country will view them with understanding, and that after dedicating 45 years of my life to its service with sincere zeal, any faults due to my limited abilities will be forgotten, just as I will soon be laid to rest. The address faced criticism from many Republicans, including Madison, who viewed it as an anti-French document and suspected Washington of pro-British sentiments. In 1839, biographer Jared Sparks noted that Washington's farewell address was published by legislative order and held in high regard as a testament to its political insights and the affection for its author. By 1972, historian James Flexner compared the address in importance to Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. In 2010, historian Ron Chernow highlighted the address as one of the most influential statements on republicanism. Retirement and his final days. In March 1797, Washington retired to Mount Vernon, where he focused on managing his plantations and other business ventures. Despite his efforts, his plantation operations yielded only modest profits, and his western lands in Piedmont faced Indian attacks and squatters who refused to pay rent, rendering them largely unproductive. Washington struggled to sell these lands without success. During his retirement, he became increasingly committed to Federalist ideals, actively supporting the Alien and Sedition Acts and encouraging Federalist John Marshall to run for Congress to challenge the Jeffersonian influence in Virginia. Restlessness set in as tensions with France escalated. The continuation of the French Revolutionary Wars led French privateers to seize American ships in 1798, deteriorating relations between the two nations and leading to the Quasi-War. Washington offered to organize an army for President Adams, and was subsequently nominated for the rank of Lieutenant General and Commander-in-Chief of the armies on July 4, 1798. He served as Commanding General from July 13, 1798, until his death 17 months later. Although he planned for a provisional army, he avoided getting involved in the specifics and strongly distanced himself from Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, remarking on their obstinate opposition to the government. Washington delegated the active leadership of the army to Major General Alexander Hamilton. During this time, no army invaded the United States, and Washington did not assume a field command. Though Mount Vernon projected an image of opulence, Washington's wealth was largely tied up in land and slaves rather than liquid assets. To generate additional income, he established a distillery for whiskey production. He also invested in land around the newly named Federal City, opting to sell individual lots to middle-income buyers to encourage development, rather than large parcels to big investors, whom he believed were less likely to commit to improvements. On December 12, 1799, Washington rode horseback to inspect his farms. He returned home late and, despite the day's inclement weather, joined his dinner guests in his damp clothes. The following day, he developed a sore throat, but was well enough to mark trees for cutting. That evening, he complained of chest congestion. The next morning, his throat was inflamed, and he had difficulty breathing. Washington instructed his estate overseer, George Rawlins, to perform bloodletting, a common medical practice of the time. His family called upon Doctors James Craik, Gustavus Richard Brown, and Elisha C. Dick for assistance, while a fourth doctor, William Thornton, arrived hours after Washington had passed away. Dr. Brown initially suspected quinsy, while Dr. Dick diagnosed a more severe, violent inflammation of the throat. The doctors continued bloodletting, removing approximately 5 pints of blood, but Washington's condition worsened. Dr. Dick suggested a tracheotomy, but the other doctors, unfamiliar with the procedure, opposed it. Washington asked Brown and Dick to leave the room, telling Dr. Craik, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." Washington's death occurred more rapidly than anticipated. Concerned about being prematurely entombed, he instructed his private secretary, Tobias Lear, to wait 3 days before his burial. According to Lear, Washington died between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. on December 14, 1799, with Martha seated at the foot of his bed. His final words were, "'Tis well," referring to his discussion with Lear about his burial. He was 67 years old. Upon learning of his death, Congress adjourned for the day, and the Speaker's chair was draped in black the following morning. Washington's funeral took place on December 18, 1799, at Mount Vernon, where he was interred. The procession included cavalry and foot soldiers, with 6 colonels serving as pallbearers. The funeral service at Mount Vernon was mostly attended by family and friends. Reverend Thomas Davis conducted the service by the vault, followed by a ceremony performed by members of Washington's Masonic Lodge from Alexandria, Virginia. News of his death spread slowly, but as it reached various regions, church bells tolled and many businesses closed. Memorial processions were held in major U.S. cities. Martha Washington wore a black mourning cape for a year and burned her correspondence with George to maintain its privacy, though 5 letters between them are known to have survived, 2 from Martha to George and 3 from him to her. The diagnosis and immediate cause of Washington's death have been subjects of debate. The account from Doctors Craik and Brown described his symptoms as consistent with Senanche trachealis, a term used then to describe severe inflammation of the upper windpipe, including quinsy. Accusations of medical malpractice have persisted since his death. Modern medical experts generally believe he likely died from severe epiglottitis, complicated by treatments such as multiple doses of calomel, a purgative, and extensive bloodletting, which may have led to hypovolemic shock. Finances of George Washington. Washington was laid to rest in the Washington family vault at Mount Vernon. At the time of his death, his estate was valued at approximately $780,000 in 1799, which would be about $14.29 million today. His peak net worth reached $587 million, including the ownership of 300 slaves. Washington owned more than 65,000 acres of land across 37 different locations. In 1830, a disgruntled former estate employee tried to steal what he believed to be Washington's skull, leading to the construction of a more secure vault. Washington had already instructed in his will that a new vault be built, as the old family vault was deteriorating and in need of repair even before his death. The new vault at Mount Vernon was completed the following year, intended to house the remains of George and Martha Washington, as well as other family members. In 1832, a congressional committee considered relocating Washington's remains to a crypt in the United States Capitol. The crypt, designed by architect Charles Bulfinch, had been constructed during the 1820s following the burning of Washington by the British in the War of 1812. However, intense Southern opposition arose, driven by concerns over sectional tensions and fears that Washington's remains could be moved to a location foreign to his native soil if the country were divided. As a result, Washington's remains remained at Mount Vernon. On October 7, 1837, Washington's remains, still in the original lead coffin, were placed within a marble sarcophagus designed by William Strickland and built by John Struthers. The sarcophagus was sealed and encased in planks, with an outer vault constructed around it. The outer vault now contains the sarcophagi of both George and Martha Washington, while the inner vault holds the remains of other Washington family members and relatives. Washington's personal life and religious views. Washington was known for his reserved demeanor, but possessed a commanding presence. He delivered speeches and made announcements as needed, though he was not particularly renowned as an orator or debater. Standing taller than most of his contemporaries, with heights reported between 6 feet (1.83 meters) and 6 feet 3.5 inches (1.92 meters), and weighing between 210 and 220 pounds (95 to 100 kilograms), he was noted for his considerable strength. He had gray blue eyes and long reddish-brown hair. Rather than wearing a powdered wig, he preferred to curl, powder, and tie his hair in a queue, following the style of the time. Washington struggled with severe dental issues throughout his life, eventually losing all but one of his teeth. During his presidency, he used several sets of false teeth, which, contrary to popular belief, were not made of wood but rather metal, ivory, bone, animal teeth, and possibly human teeth acquired from slaves. These dental problems caused him constant pain, which he managed with laudanum. An accomplished equestrian, Washington was praised by Thomas Jefferson as the best horseman of his age. He collected thoroughbreds at Mount Vernon, with Blueskin and Nelson being his favorites. Washington enjoyed hunting foxes, deer, ducks, and other game. He was also a skilled dancer and regularly attended the theater. While he drank alcohol in moderation, he was morally opposed to excessive drinking, smoking, gambling, and profanity. Washington descended from Anglican minister Lawrence Washington, whose conflicts with the Church of England may have influenced his family's decision to immigrate to America. Born in April 1732, he was baptized as an infant and became a devoted member of the Anglican Church throughout his life. 380, over more than 20 years, he served as a vestryman and churchwarden at both Fairfax Parish and Truco Parish in Virginia. Washington engaged in private prayer and Bible reading daily, and publicly encouraged prayer for both individuals and the nation. Although he may have regularly taken communion before the Revolution, he did not do so after the war. Washington believed in a wise, inscrutable, and irresistible Creator God who was actively involved in the universe, contrasting with deistic views. He referred to God using Enlightenment terms such as providence, the Creator, the Almighty, and the divine author or supreme being. Washington saw divine intervention in various aspects of life, from battles and wars to the protection of his own life and the formation of the United States. Historian Ron Chernow noted that Washington avoided overt displays of religiosity or using religion for partisan purposes, and rarely mentioned Jesus Christ in his private correspondence or public writings. Instead, he often quoted or paraphrased the Bible and referred to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Promoting religious toleration in a diverse nation, Washington attended services of various Christian denominations and banned anti-Catholic sentiments within the Army. He employed individuals at Mount Vernon regardless of their religious affiliations and recognized major religious groups during his presidency while advocating for religious toleration. Rooted in Enlightenment ideas, Washington respected organized Christianity and its clergy, stating in 1793, "We have abundant reason to rejoice that in this land the light of truth and reason has triumphed over the power of bigotry and superstition." Freemasonry, popular in the late 18th century for its moral teachings, attracted Washington with its emphasis on Enlightenment values such as rationality, reason, and brotherhood. Unlike European lodges, American Masonic lodges did not hold anti-clerical views. Washington was initiated into the Masonic Lodge in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in November 1752, at the age of 20, becoming one of its first entered apprentices. Within a year, he advanced to the rank of Master Mason. Although he held the Masonic order in high regard, his attendance at lodges was intermittent. In 1777, he was asked to be Grand Master of the newly established Grand Lodge of Virginia, but declined due to his responsibilities with the Continental Army. After 1782, he maintained correspondence with Masonic lodges and members and served as the Charter Master of Alexandria Masonic Lodge No. 22, now Alexandria Washington Lodge No. 22, in 1788–89. George Washington and slavery. During Washington's lifetime, slavery was deeply embedded in the economic and social fabric of Virginia, a practice that continued both after the Revolution and with Virginia's statehood. Slavery was legal in all 13 colonies before the American Revolution. Washington owned and rented enslaved African Americans, with over 577 individuals living and working at Mount Vernon during his life. He inherited some slaves, acquired 84 dower slaves through his marriage to Martha, and purchased at least 71 more between 1752 and 1773. After 1786, he rented slaves, and by the time of his death, he was renting 41. Initially, Washington's views on slavery aligned with those of most Virginia planters. However, beginning in the 1760s, he began to question the institution. His doubts were initially sparked by his shift from tobacco to grain farming, which left him with an excess of slaves and led him to question the system's economic viability. His growing opposition was further influenced by the principles of the Revolution and the views of revolutionary friends such as Lafayette and Hamilton. Historians generally agree that the Revolution played a significant role in shaping Washington's evolving stance on slavery. Kenneth Morgan notes that Washington began to express private concerns about slavery more frequently after 1783. Despite his growing doubts, Washington continued to rely on slave labor for his agricultural operations. Accounts of how slaves were treated at Mount Vernon vary. Kenneth Morgan suggests that Washington was frugal with spending on clothing and bedding, provided minimal food, and enforced strict control over his slaves, requiring them to work from dawn to dusk throughout the year. Conversely, Dorothy Twohig reports that the conditions for slaves were at least adequate in terms of food, clothing, and housing. Washington faced increasing debt related to the costs of maintaining slaves. Although he held an ingrained sense of racial superiority, he did not harbor personal animosity towards African Americans. Enslaved families working at different locations on the plantation were permitted to visit each other on their days off. For 116, slaves received 2 hours off for meals during the workday and had Sundays and religious holidays off. Some accounts indicate that Washington was opposed to flogging but occasionally authorized it as a last resort for both men and women slaves. He employed a combination of rewards and punishments to enforce discipline and productivity. Washington tried to appeal to individual pride, offering better clothing and blankets to those he deemed most deserving, and providing cash rewards. While he preferred watchfulness and admonition to discipline, he would resort to punishment if necessary. This could range from demotion to field work and physical beatings to the permanent separation of families through sale. Historian Ron Chernow states that overseers were required to warn slaves before resorting to flogging and needed Washington's written permission to do so, though his frequent absences sometimes made this difficult. During his presidency, Washington periodically brought several of his slaves to the federal capital. When the capital moved from New York City to Philadelphia in 1791, he began rotating his slave household staff between the capital and Mount Vernon. This strategy was a deliberate attempt to circumvent Pennsylvania's Slavery Abolition Act, which mandated that any slave residing in the state for more than 6 months would be automatically freed. In May 1796, Ona Judge, Martha's personal and favored slave, escaped to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Washington, at Martha's request, made an unsuccessful attempt to capture her with the help of a Treasury agent. Later, in February 1797, around the time of his 65th birthday, Washington's personal slave Hercules Posey escaped from Mount Vernon and was never recaptured. A census conducted by Washington in February 1786 recorded 224 slaves at Mount Vernon. By the time of his death in 1799, the slave population at Mount Vernon had increased to 317, including 143 children. Washington owned 124 slaves, leased 40, and held 153 slaves as part of his wife's dower interest. Many of these slaves were too young or too old to work, contributing to an expanded slave population and resulting in the plantation operating at a financial loss. Abolitionism in the United States. Based on his private correspondence and contemporary accounts, Washington gradually developed a cautious sympathy toward abolitionism. This evolution culminated in his will, which stipulated that his longtime valet, Billy Lee, would be freed immediately, and that the remainder of his personally owned slaves would be liberated upon Martha's death. During his presidency, Washington chose to remain publicly silent on the issue of slavery, believing it to be a deeply divisive topic that could jeopardize national unity. During the Revolutionary War, Washington's views on slavery began to shift. In a 1778 letter to Lund Washington, he expressed a desire to be rid of Negroes, reflecting his discomfort with slavery, especially when discussing the exchange of slaves for land he wished to acquire. 430, the following year, he indicated his intention not to separate enslaved families due to changes in ownership. Throughout the 1780s, Washington privately supported the idea of gradual emancipation. He endorsed a plan proposed by Lafayette to buy land and free slaves to work it, but chose not to participate in the project. In 1785, Washington conveyed his support for emancipation to prominent Methodists Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, though he did not sign their petition. In personal letters from the following year, he expressed a preference for ending slavery through gradual legislative measures, aligning with the anti-slavery sentiments prevalent in the literature of the time that he read. Although he reduced his purchases of slaves post-war, he continued to acquire them in small numbers. In 1788, Washington rejected a proposal from French abolitionist Jacques Brisset to establish an abolitionist society in Virginia, citing that the timing was not yet right, despite his personal support for the idea. Historian Philip D. Morgan notes that Washington was keen to avoid risking national unity. Washington did not address anti-slavery petitions he received, and slavery was not mentioned in his final address to Congress or his farewell address. The first concrete sign of Washington's intention to free his slaves appears in a 1794 letter to his secretary, Tobias Lear. Washington instructed Lear to sell his land in western Virginia, explaining privately that this was to liberate a certain species of property which I possess, very repugnantly to my own feelings. However, he struggled to find buyers for his land, was reluctant to break up slave families, and faced obstacles with the Custis heirs, who refused to free their dower slaves simultaneously. On July 9, 1799, Washington completed his last will, which included detailed provisions about slavery. He decreed that all his slaves were to be freed after Martha's death, explaining that immediate freedom was not feasible due to intermarriage between his slaves and those of his wife. He also mandated that the freed individuals be cared for, with the younger ones receiving education and being placed in suitable occupations. Washington thus freed 123 slaves, a significant act for a major slaveholder of his time. 1 year after Washington's death, On January 1, 1801, Martha Washington signed an order to free his slaves. Many of them, having lived near Mount Vernon, were hesitant to leave. Some chose to stay with or near Martha to remain close to their families. In accordance with Washington's will, funds were allocated to support the young, elderly, and infirm former slaves until the early 1830s. Legacy of George Washington. Washington's legacy stands as one of the most significant in American history, having served as the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a hero of the Revolution, and the first President of the United States. Historians often cite his crucial role in the founding of the nation, with Revolutionary War comrade Henry Lee eulogizing him as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Lee's tribute has become a defining element of Washington's reputation, with many biographers viewing him as the epitome of republicanism. He established numerous precedents for the national government and the presidency, earning the title Father of his Country. As early as 1778, Washington consistently ranks among the highest of U.S. presidents. Internationally, Washington is celebrated as a symbol of liberation and nationalism, having led the first successful revolution against a colonial empire. While Federalists embraced him as their emblem, Jeffersonians remained wary of his influence for years, delaying the construction of the Washington Monument. Washington was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on January 31, 1781. In 1879, Congress designated Washington's birthday as a federal holiday. During the American Bicentennial, Public Law 94-479, enacted on January 19, 1976, retroactively promoted him to the rank of General of the Armies of the United States. President Gerald Ford proclaimed that Washington would rank first among all officers of the Army, past and present, and on March 13, 1978, Washington was officially promoted to General of the Armies. In 1809, Mason Locke Weems published a hagiographic biography of Washington, aiming to humanize him and foster patriotism and morality through enduring myths, such as the famous cherry tree story. Although Weems' accounts have never been definitively proven or disproven, they significantly shaped Washington's public image. Historian John Ferling notes that Washington is unique among the Founding Fathers for having been described as godlike, with his character undergoing the most extensive scrutiny. Biographer Douglas Southall Freeman remarked on Washington's remarkable character, while historian David Hackett Fisher defined it as a combination of integrity, self-discipline, courage, honesty, resolve, and respect for others. Polls consistently place Washington among the highest-ranked presidents. In the 21st century, Washington's legacy has been critically examined. Ron Chernow describes Washington as striving for fairness in his dealings with Native Americans, advocating for their transition to fixed agricultural communities rather than outright land confiscation or forcible removal. Washington also criticized settlers who mistreated Native Americans, though he held little hope for peaceful relations while frontier settlers harbored prejudiced views. Conversely, Colin G. Calloway argues that Washington's pursuit of Native American land was driven by a lifelong obsession, leading to policies and campaigns that had devastating effects on indigenous peoples. Calloway contends that Washington's approach, while hoping for peaceful negotiations, justified violent expeditions against Native American communities when resistance occurred. Washington, like other Founding Fathers, is also criticized for his ownership of enslaved people. Although he privately supported the gradual abolition of slavery, he did not champion any legislative initiatives to end it, leading some activists to call for the removal of his name from public buildings and his statues from public spaces. Monuments and currency. Numerous places and monuments have been named to honor George Washington, with the most prominent being Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, and the state of Washington, which is the only U.S. state named after a president. On February 21, 1885, the Washington Monument was dedicated. This 555-foot marble obelisk, located on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., was constructed in two phases, from 1848 to 1854 and from 1879 to 1884. It held the title of the tallest structure in the world from 1884 until 1889. Washington is also featured among the 4 U.S. presidents depicted on Mount Rushmore, a monumental sculpture by Gutzon Borglum located in South Dakota. In addition, several secondary schools and universities bear Washington's name, including George Washington University and Washington University in St. Louis. George Washington is featured on various contemporary U.S. currency, including the $1 bill, the presidential $1 coin, and the $quarter coin, commonly known as the Washington quarter. Additionally, Washington was one of the first individuals depicted on U.S. postage stamps in 1847, alongside Benjamin Franklin. Since then, he has appeared on numerous postage issues, more frequently than any other individual.